see here. Alex, if you would, if you drop the choir lights there, it might give a better view. All right. So I want to connect tonight to last week where we discussed the biblical foundation and the way this works, the way that life is supposed to work is we state from the outset that we have a presupposition. So we're all looking at the same evidence in the scientific community. We're all looking at the same facts, if you will. And once you receive the facts, you need to interpret the facts. And both the scientific community and the church approach those facts with presuppositions. And my presupposition, your presupposition, should be that the Word of God is our absolute authority. And so what we do is we try to understand the Word of God. That's the constant. That's the rock, because it's connected to the rock. And so that's our foundation, and we begin working from that foundation. And we build or discard scientific theories based on that foundation. And so what's fascinating is that it's within that framework that science really took off. From the framework that this universe was created by a rational, organized being, and therefore we can conduct test after test after test, and we should find similar results. And as a result of that, it all came from an organized God created a rational universe. I think it was Einstein that said the most amazing thing about the universe is that it's understandable. And that came from a being that was organized. And as a result of that, we live in this stable environment, this stable universe, and we've begun progressing in the scientific and technological world the way we have. And technology is a gift, it's a blessing. It can very easily turn into an idol, and it can warp us. But it's a gift. I see technology as a way that man has used his God-given ability to rule and subdue and dominate and work in a way that is a blessing to a variety and multitude of people. And so, but my point is all of this came from a framework, a presupposition that we're following an organized, rational being. And we need to understand that the scientific community, the secular scientific community, is also approaching the facts with presuppositions. And those presuppositions are not with a God in mind. And so they're trying to figure everything out without a deity. And we just need to know that. And they're not going to bow down easily to a divine being. Mark Twain said, and I'll paraphrase, he said, it's a lot easier to fool a man than to convince a man that he's been fooled. Is that true? That's true. At least in my experience it is. And sometimes I've been the fool, the fooled one. And so you've got pride involved. You've got Romans 1 involved, where scientists are suppressing the truth. And we've got to face that. I mean, Richard Dawkins, one of the most outspoken atheists, said that biology, and I'm paraphrasing, but biology is approaching science as though it had a purpose or as though it had a design to it. And yet he's an outspoken atheist. And so he's really coming up against the truth and suppressing it. So at the outset, I want to pay credence. Pretty much everything you're going to see on the screen tonight is from this book that I highly recommend. I've read a couple different things on creation, and this was an incredibly readable read. It's called The New Creationism by Paul Garner, and it's written for a layman and makes things very simple, and I highly recommend it. Much of the information you'll see, but not all the information that's in this book will be on the screen. Another book that I highly recommend, I haven't finished this one yet, but I'm in the midst of reading it. Your dad highly recommended this book, James. A Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel. And he started out as an atheist, article journalist, and article writer and journalist, and his wife was converted to Christ, and he soon followed. But he wrote A Case for Christ, A Case for a Creator, and I believe one other one. But A Case for a Creator is excellent, and I'll share some quotes from it at the end of the night. But let's go ahead and look. I'm not, like I said, I'm not going to exhaust the book, The New Creationism, because number one, I'm going to be showing you a video by Paul Garner on the fossil record, specifically in regard to the flood. And so I'm largely going to leave that untouched, and that'll be an upcoming video that you'll get to see. And then I've been emailing recently the youth group, and a couple of us went to Is Genesis History at the cinemas this last week. It was a one night only. Alex was saying that they might have another showing, and if they do, I highly recommend you go to it. But if they don't, I'm hoping to be able to get the online way to show it to you guys or buy the DVD, because it was a really good film. And so you'll be seeing that. But a lot of what I wanted to say, they covered in a way better than I could cover it. So I hope to show that to you as well. So this is not exhaustive, is my point. But let's go on. And now we're going to begin looking at the scientific theories and build those on the biblical foundation that God created the world in 6 literal days. And the world, as far as we understand it from Scripture, is not much over 6,000 or 7,000 years old. And that's laughable in the scientific community. But what we see is so much evidence starting to inch back nearer and nearer and nearer to that. And it's just fascinating. It's absolutely fascinating to see it happen. But it shouldn't shock us. Some people insert time into the genealogies in Genesis, and I'll be the first to say that genealogies in the Bible do skip generations. That's a fact. In Matthew's genealogy, you can compare Matthew, I believe it's to Chronicles, and see generations skipped. And so Matthew will say this person had this son, but several names were skipped in that process. Matthew had a reason for doing that. When we went over Matthew was narrowing everything down to 14 names at a time. So he had a theological agenda for why he truncated the genealogies. But that happens in Scripture. Genealogies do get truncated. But in Genesis, it's hard to do that. And I had to read a paper on it. I believe that's the way Moody Bible Institute understands the Genesis narrative. But it's hard to do that because, number one, you go through and it tells you how old the guy was when he had the child. And that's not as easy to say it was truncated. And like I said, truncating is possible. It's not breaking any laws. But to say that the guy's age is a troubling thing. Then when you take the genealogies from Genesis and start looking at sister genealogies or different ways to say when was this guy born and when was this guy born, it seems like those genealogies are pretty much keeping to historicity as it happened. And so I'm not a fan of inserting time. Some do into the genealogies. I just don't find the evidence persuasive. And it's hard with these things to not say that you're beginning to be driven by the science, the current scientific method, than you are the scriptures. And that's what we have to be careful about. For a long time, they did not believe, scientists, archaeologists did not believe that the Hittite people existed. And then lo and behold, the Hittite people were unearthed. And there they are. And the Bible was right. And the Bible is becoming more and more an archaeological resource than it is a myth, as what they thought. And so we just need to stick to our guns, I think, and say this is what the Bible says as far as I can understand it, and I think scientists will catch up with the Bible eventually. And like I pointed out last week, we know a baby in the womb is a baby, but people with a lot of credentials will not call that baby a baby. And so people with education are driven by presuppositions that don't line up with the Bible always. Okay, so let's get started on creation. Go ahead, Matthew, if you take us to the first slide. So we're going to just essentially summarize the Big Bang very succinctly here as we go through the night. So let's go, Matthew, and we're just going to go from point to point. So according to the Big Bang theory, the universe began 13.7 billion years ago. Go ahead. All the matter and energy of the universe was compressed into an infinitely hot, dense state. Okay? From this state, it expanded to generate into the universe we observe today. Space and time are also considered to have been generated during the Big Bang. So you've got time, space, and matter. So don't think of the Big Bang as there was space and then the Big Bang happened into the space. Because the Big Bang theory believes that space came into existence at that point too. So there is nothing. As Francis Schaeffer would say, nothing but nothing. There's nothing. And space comes into being too with the Big Bang. So already you should be beginning to think we're talking a little bit about a faith theory here, because it's somewhat unreasonable, and somewhat is an understatement. As the universe expanded outwards, temperatures dropped sufficiently for hydrogen and helium atoms to form. Go ahead, Matthew. About 100 million years after the Big Bang, the first stars began to form from clouds of gas in the young universe, which gave rise to the Milky Way and other galaxies. When these first generation stars had grown old, some exploded as supernovae, with the resulting fragments recombining into new stars and repeating the process. Our sun is said to be a third generation star and relatively recent, being formed around 5 billion years ago. Around some of the stars, debris coalesced to form planets. And on at least one planet, the Earth, living things evolved. Okay? All right. So that's, in a nutshell, the Big Bang theory. We're going to look at some main evidence that they purport, which they'd argue supports their theory. Go ahead, Matthew. The universe is bathed in weak radiation. So let's unearth that. Go, Matthew, to the next. What does the universe being bathed in weak radiation mean? So Arno Penzias, a Nobel Prize winner, detected faint radio noise from all directions around the universe. And so what he detected is that there's rising heat from 2.73 degrees above absolute zero. And so the outer space is as cold as cold can get, except it's not completely absolute zero. There is some heat in there. And the scientists believe that this heat, it's understood as a dying ember from the Big Bang, so that there's still remaining heat in the universe from this incredible massive explosion. Light waves from the initial fireball stretched by expansion of space detectable as microwaves. So what they see, and I believe this is in the next slide that we'll talk about this, is that the universe observably is expanding, and there seems to be a lot of evidence for this, that it is expanding. And one of the things that scientists are coming to terms with, that if it's expanding, if you put that in reverse, it all comes back to a point of what scientists refer to as singularity, which they're really uncomfortable with, because that says, okay, it's all going out this way. Well, when it comes back to here, what was before here? What was before the singularity? And we'll talk more about that as we go. But so this is the first evidence which they believe supports the Big Bang. Go ahead, Matthew. Distant galaxies seem to be rushing away from us. That's what I just said. Go ahead, Matthew, to the bottom there. The measurable wavelength of light is increasing. So the wavelength is spreading out, which means it's getting further away from us. One of the examples that someone gave that I think is helpful to understand this is that when you hear an ambulance coming, that sound waves can work similarly to light waves. When you hear an ambulance coming, the sound is spread out as you hear it from a distance. But when it gets close to you, it's very sharp. It's much more distinct and even seemingly shorter. And then as it starts getting further away, it starts sounding longer. The sound goes on for a while as you hear it. It's not nearly as distinct because the sound waves are stretching out. And so they're seeing that the stars, the light waves that are left from them are stretching out, which means that they're moving away from us, galaxies, shifting. This shift is greater the further a galaxy is from us. So the most distant galaxies seem to be moving at a greater rate than the galaxies closer to us. So the further out, the faster they're going, it seems. Okay, go ahead. The light elements are found in the right amounts. The light elements are found in the right amounts. Go ahead, Matthew. Proportions of light elements should be predictable, they would say, and the predictions seem consistent with what we observe. And these are these different chemicals and gases that they would say should be there with this type of explosion, and they find those gases there in the solar system. Okay, go ahead, Matthew. All right, so this is the Big Bang Theory in a nutshell. With the evidence. Let's go on again, Matthew, to some doubts about the Big Bang, and then we'll look at a creationist cosmology that's based on a biblical foundation and see how we can make sense of the data. Okay, go ahead, Matthew. Some doubts. The cosmic radiation is too smooth in relation to the Big Bang Theory. Go ahead. So the Big Bang Theory attributes irregularities in the primordial fireball, which led to the development of stars, galaxies, etc. So irregularities in heat. So there should be cool areas, there should be more hot areas. These irregularities should continue to be detectable. If that's the case, if they're right about that, these heat and cool irregularities should be detectable by observing variations in temperature, and no variations of sufficient size have been found, which has caused Big Bang theorists to try to reevaluate their schema to make sense of this, because the evidence isn't there in the heating and the cooling. The variations are only very, very slight, less than what they would need to prove their point. Go ahead, Matthew. And let me say at the outset, and Paul Garner is a very fair and balanced, and that's what I've appreciated. I've read creationists that trouble me sometimes, but he really appears to be as fair and balanced and doesn't ridicule. Sometimes you get into creationists and they ridicule the other beliefs, which I don't think does anybody any favors. And he was good to point out that in any theory of making sense of the scientific facts, scientists are going to have their theories worked on and changed and further developed, and they take away this and add this. And so that's normal, and he's quick to point that out. The most distant galaxies are too mature. When you look out, so effectively, when you look through a telescope, you know, when we see, let me say it this way, when you see the sun, and nobody recommends looking directly at the sun, but if you did look at the sun, you are seeing what the sun looked like 8 minutes ago. So for all you know, 8 minutes earlier, the sun's gone. No. But that's the fact. You're seeing it 8 minutes ago. And so the idea is that when you look at a star through, or a galaxy through a telescope, and we've got incredibly powerful ones, you're effectively looking back in time. You're looking at those galaxies years and years and years ago. So when we see the North Star, you can go out and see the North Star if we have a clear night tonight. You're seeing the North Star as it was, I think it's somewhere in the realm of 382 years ago. It's the date of the Salem witch trials. So that's how far, that's what you're seeing it as. That's how it looks to us now, but that's 380 some years ago, as we see it. So the most distant galaxies are too mature. So let's go and look at the data here, Matthew. Go ahead. So looking more deeply into the universe is equivalent to looking back in time. The further we look back, galaxies should be less developed. Astronomers are finding much too mature galaxies having formed much too soon after the Big Bang. And so they're looking out there and they're seeing these way mature galaxies, and they're saying that shouldn't be the case based on the Big Bang, our understanding of the Big Bang. These should not be nearly as developed as they are this many years ago, as we see them through a telescope, which is troubling to that theory. Okay, go ahead, Matthew. Okay, so this is, we're going to consider a creationist cosmology put forth by a guy named Humphreys. I want to say it was like a 400, 500 page book, and his theory is getting to be tweaked. I think he developed it in the 90s, trying to make sense of the data, and Garner puts it up there as what he thinks is the top new creationist understanding of these distant stars, and the age of the universe being 13 some billion years old, or appearing to be that old. And I think you'll find his Humphreys theory pretty fascinating. Okay, go ahead, Matthew. Okay, so Russell Humphreys theorized a new cosmology of the universe, placing Earth at the center of the universe. And so Big Bang theorists don't do that. That's in a sense offensive to their theory, because man is just a speck. He developed from nothing. He's going to nothing. So why would Earth be special? That's kind of the theory, the presupposition. And so it's hard for me to wrap my head around it, but the illustration that has been given to illustrate this is, if you picture a balloon that's expanding and you have a bug on that balloon, the bug's not going to find the center of that balloon. It's going to go around that balloon, but there's really no center point, as it's all just expanding on the outside of the balloon. It's still, that doesn't help me especially, but that's the one that a couple people give. But Humphreys theorized, what if the earth is at the very center of the universe? Let's start there. And the idea is that for a long time, there was the belief that everything revolved around the earth. And there's a reason the church thought that, even though they were wrong. The reason they thought that is because the Genesis narrative was written with a man centered, and I don't want to say that in a bad way, but it was written sort of from man's perspective. It's a God-centered story, but the earth was created for man. Just like I said this morning, he's the pinnacle of creation. So walking away with the understanding that everything revolves around the earth, it can make sense from reading Genesis 1. Now, it's not the case in regards to us revolving around the sun versus the sun revolving, or in the case of the sun revolving around us instead of us revolving around the sun. So it's not true there, obviously. But could the earth be the center of the universe? Is that possible? The Genesis account seems to talk in that sort of way, that all of this was created for man to get to know God. So Humphrey starts with that theory. It doesn't have to be the case, but it would make sense in reading Genesis 1. So he starts there, and what he finds is absolutely fascinating. And it's not just what he finds, it's what secular scientists are finding. Go ahead, Matthew. Okay, measurements of galaxy redshifts, and so the redshift is them moving away from, they're like moving out. Measurements of galaxy redshifts appear to be quantized. And so what that means is, as far as I understand it, is that when you measure these galaxies moving out from Earth, and you do that all around Earth in every direction, what scientists are finding is that all of these galaxies that are moving out, they're all dating around the same time in circles, concentric circles around the Earth. It's fascinating. So Earth seems to be the center of all of this outward movement in every direction. Earth seems to be in the middle. So an illustration would be, it's not a perfect illustration, but you picture those Matryoshka dolls from Russia. My mom and dad always bring them back, where you start taking them apart and you get down to the most little. They're not perfect because they're not perfectly around the little guy at the bottom. But that's kind of the idea, that each set, as you date these galaxies moving out, they're all dating around the same time around planet Earth. Their arrangements appear in concentric shells around Earth. Odds for this arrangement are less than 1 in a trillion. The best three-dimensional map of the universe shows galaxies centered on Earth. Sloan Digital Sky Survey. And so Humphreys starts there, and he says there's evidence for this. Evidence backs this up. So he starts there with a creationist cosmology. Then let's go further, Matthew. This theory incorporates the Big Bang theory of singularity. He doesn't believe in the Big Bang, but what he's saying is that the Big Bang speaks to singularity. If everything's moving out, it must have all come at one point, at some point, right? And so he utilizes this concept of singularity, that it all started in one place. And even Arno Penzias, the Nobel Prize winner that was instrumental, Hubble was a big part in seeing these redshifts too, where things are moving out. Arno Penzias, even though he believes in the Big Bang, he says, I'm paraphrasing, but he says, what we find as we consider the expanding universe is could be no better said than what you find in Genesis 1, that in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth. So he's saying, look, I can't say it any better than Genesis 1 says it. In the beginning. In the beginning. But he's looking at it from a Big Bang, which I think the Big Bang is really set up to exclude God, not really involve him. So I'm uncomfortable with that. But I am comfortable with this concept of singularity. So let's look here. Okay, so what Humphreys is pointing out is he's saying the measurable wavelength of light is increasing, and that's well supported. That's well supported that everything's moving out. This observable fact seems well supported in Scripture regarding the heavens being stretched or spread out. And so he says, you could look at that as just a sort of lyric, a fancy way of describing how God created the world. But he's saying there could be some scientific support for that, that the universe is being stretched or spread out. And there's several passages that speak to that. Okay, go ahead, Matthew. Okay, utilizing these two considerations, along with incorporating Einstein's theory of relativity, Humphreys theorized a new creationist cosmology of time dilation. And so what he's speaking to as far as Einstein's theory of relativity is that we seem to understand time as being a constant. But Einstein, with his theory of relativity, essentially, if I understand it right, spoke to the idea of where there's less gravitational pull, time moves faster. And where there's more gravitational pull, time moves slower. So if you took a clock and went to the top of a mountain where there was less gravitational pull, the clock should move faster than if you had it at the bottom of the mountain. And that's been demonstrated time and time again that that's true, that theory of relativity stands up to testing. Okay? So what Humphreys is doing is he's applying that to a time dilation theory with the universe. And hopefully it'll become clear as we look at the facts here. Go ahead, Matthew. So God has caused, Humphreys theorizes, the expansion of the universe from what is known as a white hole. So he doesn't speak to a Big Bang, which is a catastrophic event that leads to things just slowly, long, over time, evolving on their own. And he doesn't go that route, which is what troubles me about the Big Bang. He speaks to this concept of a white hole. A black hole, we know, sucks in everything. It sucks things to it. The white hole, things stream out of it. And so a white hole streams out matter and energy, and he's looking at that as, if you would call the scientific way in which God created the universe and all that's in it. He says these initial conditions would have mathematically created a net gravitational effect toward the center of the early universe. And so, according to current scientific data, the Earth is at the center of the universe, which would mean that the gravitational pull is greater here than anywhere else. And so, as a result of that, and the result of gravity's effect on time, he says, given gravity's distortion of time, time would have passed at differing rates in different parts of the universe. Time dilation would have led to clocks, quote unquote, at the edges of the universe running faster than clocks at the center. And so this is what's fascinating. This is where Paul Garner, this is what he speaks to. Go ahead, Matthew, and I'm going to finish this creationist cosmology with his quote. After evaluating Humphreys' creationist cosmology, this is what Garner says. The extraordinary implication is that only a few days might have passed on the earth, which observations suggest is at or near the center, while the equivalent of billions of years were passing further out in the universe. Is that incredible? So scientists could be looking at these stars and trying to measure the light and saying, man, the universe appears to be 13 billion years old. If light is a constant, which is a question, light doesn't have to be a constant. That's called uniformitarianism, where they look at everything and say, well, if light's running this fast today, it should run this fast for eternity. That's not necessarily true, but supposing it is, you would come to the realization that the universe is billions of years old. But according to Einstein's theory of relativity, you could have this starlight travel and make sense of the days and the apparent billions of years. It's so funny. Recently, a movie came out, and I think the name of it's Interstellar. And in it, they're in outer space, and they're doing all this stuff, and they have to visit this planet. And I think they're looking for life outside of planet Earth. And they have to visit this planet. But according to a theory like this, they say, listen, we have to move quickly, because 1 minute on this planet is equivalent to like 7 years in another place on the spaceship. And they're leaving one astronaut on the spaceship. So they go down to this planet, and they can only spend like 7 minutes, which is like 49 years on the spaceship. And the one astronaut that stays on the spaceship goes into this deep sleep. And they literally, in the movie, spend 7 minutes or something. I'm conjecturing exactly how it happened. And they get back up to the aircraft. The guy wakes up, and he's 50 years older. It's the craziest thing. But that's this idea that Humphreys is getting at, which is just a fascinating thought. And of course, this is just a theory, and Garner already pointed out that elements of it are being tweaked scientifically. But I share this to say that whether this is the theory or not, it is all going to make sense. And God will have an explanation. And we will all say, I knew you were right. Some way, some shape, somehow. But I think we need to start with our understanding of Scripture and base theories off that. And that's how science developed in the past, and that's how it will in the future, because God's Word's the rock. Okay, let's go ahead, Matthew, to the next. All right, there's no place like home. I think this is also helpful for us to consider. What we're going to do is we're going to take a quick visit to each of the planets in our Milky Way galaxy and just take a look at how those planets are, and then take a look at Earth. And some of what you've heard about Earth, you've heard me share before, and we'll move over it pretty quickly. But I want you to see Earth in comparison to these other planets. Interestingly, the word for stars means like light. It means light. And so God doesn't mention in Genesis 1 making planets, but he mentions making lights, of which the planets could have, and I believe were, part of that when he mentions the stars in Genesis 1. But let's look at these other planets. So the word, what I'm saying is that word had the semantic range to pick up things like planets. All right, let's consider Mercury. It's the planet nearest to the sun. Its surface is of craters, lava plains, sinuous cliffs, 9,840 feet tall. So I just want you to imagine this is where you're going home tonight, okay? And just think of the intimidation of it. The surface temp it goes from negative 279 to 800 degrees. And you think you had it bad. The atmosphere is mostly sodium and potassium. No oxygen. Okay? All right, let's go ahead. Venus. It's the brightest object next to sun and moon. It has a surface pressure on it that's 90 times greater than that of Earth. The surface temp is 881 degrees, sufficient to melt lead. Its atmosphere is of carbon dioxide and nitrogen. Clouds of sulfuric acid obscure its surface. Mars. The southern hemisphere is dominated by volcanoes. One of the volcanoes I wrote down here is Olympus Mons. It's 375 miles wide, 85,000 feet high. It has vast canyon system, hundreds of miles wide. It has huge dust storms, which can engulf the whole planet for months. Atmosphere of mainly carbon dioxide. Okay, Matthew? Jupiter. You could fit 11 Earths side by side to go across its equator. So that's how big Jupiter is. It spins on its axis completely around in under 10 hours, which results in having wind speeds of 435 miles an hour. It has a thick atmosphere of hydrogen and helium, non-conducive to people like us. Go ahead. Saturn. Its density is less than water. So if you could fit Saturn in the bathtub, it would float, Garner points out. It has winds reaching 1,865 miles per hour at the equator. It has a thick atmosphere also of hydrogen, helium, methane, ammonia. Uranus. This is the planet that Garner points out that we know most little about. Its center is thought to have a small rocky core, a deep liquid ocean, and it has a deep atmosphere of hydrogen and helium. Neptune. Center thought to be small rocky core, has a great dark spot, a huge storm in that atmosphere is half the size of the Earth that they observe. It has a deep atmosphere of hydrogen, helium, and methane. I'm concerned that that top one was left from the previous one, small rocky core. I don't think that fits with Neptune. Okay, go ahead, Matthew. Pluto, which has been reclassified as of late, but I put it on here nonetheless. Sometimes nearer to the sun than Neptune, it runs on an elliptical path. It's thought to have a thin atmosphere. It's thought to have a frozen surface of methane, nitrogen, and carbon monoxide. So I share these things to say to you and to show you how inhospitable the other planets are. Okay? We need to catch that. In comparison to planet Earth. Go ahead, Matthew. Okay, so the current scientific theory on how all of these planets came to be is called the solar nebula theory. And I want you to hear this theory, and this is the theory that's supposed by cosmologists. So we're just going to summarize it very quickly like we did the Big Bang. Okay, so they believe that the planetary system formed from a rotating cloud of gas surrounding our young sun about 4.6 billion years ago. So a cloud of gas is going around our sun, and that's the beginning of how our planetary system formed. Go ahead. The cloud is thought to have collapsed into a flattened disk and cooled down, leading to dust grains condensing out of the gas. So the dust began to gather. Go ahead. Within the disk that's now orbiting the sun, these dust grains are said to have collided and stuck together, forming larger pieces, forming the rocky inner layer of planets. Some of these objects became so large they were able to collect and retain helium and hydrogen atoms and became giant gas planets. As the sun grew hotter, it blew away the remaining gas and dust, leaving the orbiting planets and moons. Okay, so this is the theory that they suppose, and we've got some doubts on the solar nebula theory. The accretion of particles in the dust cloud appears faulty. Experiments show the exact opposite. Particles breaking up versus sticking together. So they're saying all these particles are sticking together and beginning to form what is now our planets. And experiments demonstrate that that doesn't happen, that they get away from each other. They don't stick together. Solar nebula theory theorizes that the sun formed from a contracting cloud of gas and dust, which should have resulted in a faster spinning sun. So let me just stop there a second. So the idea is, so an example that was given that I think is really helpful is you watch the Olympics with the ice skating, okay? And when you watch those ice skaters and they start out in their spins, okay, they're moving fast, right? And as they move their body parts in, do they move faster or slower? Faster. And so the solar nebula theory says that the sun formed by condensing, and as a result of that, it should be the thing that's moving, that's spinning the fastest, and everything else around it should be spinning more slowly because it's at the center. But tests show the exact opposite, with the sun possessing 2% of angular momentum, with the planets possessing the remaining 98%. So it's the exact opposite of what you would have expected to find were that theory true. Okay, go ahead. Solar nebula theory should result in similar movements of planets. So they all should be rotating in the same direction. Venus, however, spins in the opposite direction of the other planets. So it's like God just said, I'm not letting you off easy on this one. You figure that out. And they try. They say that a meteor must have hit it and started back in the other direction. Venus, however, spins in the opposite direction of the other planets, and Uranus spins on its side, which is not what you would expect from their theory. Okay, go ahead. All right, so take all that and consider what scientists, how they refer to this Earth as the Goldilocks planet, which I referred to in the message, that it's just the right way. It's just the right temperature. It's just the right size, all these things. And another way to describe it is the anthropic principle, which comes from the Greek word anthropos, which is for man. So it's the man principle. This Earth was created with man in mind. Okay, go ahead, Matthew. So the Earth has stable temperatures. The Earth is 93 million miles away from the sun, not 90 million or not 96 million, which would make it way too cold or way too hot. The atmosphere serves as a thermal blanket regulating the temperature. Our atmosphere doesn't let heat escape. It keeps us just perfect. Oceans serve as a giant thermostat, regulating seasonal temperatures at an annual average of 57 degrees. So stable temperatures. Go ahead, Matthew. The Earth's tilt is at 23.5 degrees. It causes our 4 seasons. No tilt would eliminate seasons and keep the same temperature year-round. Now that might sound potentially attractive, although I love the seasons personally. Becky's parents live in Florida, and I couldn't fathom living in Florida. Now God may have me there someday, but it would drive me nuts. You go down for Christmas, and everybody's got their lawn decorated, and you're like, what? So it would eliminate the season, keep the same temperature. No tilt would result, continuing with no tilt. No tilt would result in only half the current lands being suitable for agriculture. If you put a double tilt from what it currently is, it would result in greater extremes in temperatures. A double tilt would result in North America and most of Europe being uninhabitable. So, I mean, you just think of the tilt that he put on this planet and what it brings about, and it makes so much of the earth habitable. It's just fascinating. Okay, especially in comparison to the other planets. I mean, you start seeing this principle. Go ahead, Matthew. The Earth's day, 24-hour day. Longer days would result in greater temperature differences. Daylight creatures would be scorched, nighttime creatures frozen. Go ahead, Matthew. Earth's atmosphere. Our atmosphere contains the optimal mixture of oxygen and nitrogen. No appreciable amounts of oxygen have been found in other planets. Our atmosphere protects, it should say us from meteors, several billion per day. Can you imagine? It burns them up. Our atmosphere protects us from harmful ultraviolet rays from the sun. Our ozone layer of the stratosphere is 6 to 30 miles high, and this helps absorb radiation, which would cause a lot of eye problems were it not to do that. Okay? And cancerous problems and a host of other things probably. Okay, Earth's oceans. While liquid is scarce in other solar systems, Earth is 70% water. There are 70 billion gallons for every single person. Water is a universal solvent carrying essential nutrients needed by living organisms. Water is transparent, allowing ocean animals to see through it, and light to reach marine plants and algae. Water has a high heat holding capacity, retaining and circulating heat efficiently. Water expands and becomes less dense, causing it to float, protecting what's below. Earth's distance causes water to exist in three forms of vapor, liquid, and ice, bringing about the hydrological system, which we desperately need for rain and the like. And so all these things, and I didn't even put on there, there's facts about the moon and how important it is, you know, for the ocean and how it oxygenates the ocean in that way with the moving of the tides. There's just so much. The moon gives us light in the night. And so there are just so many different features of planet Earth. And that's just talking big picture. We're not even talking about the male and the female physiology and all of these sort of things. So go ahead, Matthew. Earth's continents. Catch this. There's enough water in the oceans to flood the Earth by 8,200 feet. Okay, so I mean, you got to figure 70 billions of gallons of water for every person. That's not just the ocean. I think it's lakes and everything else. But yeah, that's a lot. Now, so why doesn't it happen? Well, look at God's design. Continents are made of rocks which are less dense than those on the ocean floor, and the continental crust is usually double the thickness of the ocean crust. And so God, I mean, you just look at it and you say, man, on was it day 3, where he raises up the land and out of the water. You know, was it day 3 that those rocks, whatever they were turned into a different density at that moment, and the crust was doubled, and those continents came shooting up? I mean, you just imagine how God does these things, and it's just absolutely fascinating. Okay, Matthew, go ahead. Okay, one more time. All right, so this is the long and short of it. I wanna close with a few things from A Case for a Creator by Lee Strobel, and I'm just going to read you a few things. The first couple quotes that I want to read you just demonstrate how virulent the scientific community is against the creationist community, and just how confident they are. And it's like Doug Wilson said, science is always settled until someone unsettles it. And they can come across very arrogant and prideful in that. Listen to what evolutionary biologist Ernst Mayr says. He says, no educated person any longer questions the validity of the so-called theory of evolution, which we now know to be a simple fact. Doesn't that just make you feel, it's just like, ow, man, that seems pretty dogmatic, doesn't it? Well, then listen to what Larry Hatfield in Science Digest, which is not a Christian magazine, listen to what he says. Scientists who utterly reject evolution may be one of our fastest growing controversial minorities. Many of the scientists supporting this position hold impressive credentials in science. So you have to see yourself in a context of a culture that's anti-God. And you just have to expect that they're going to be attacking whatever the Bible says. And you just got to say, I might as well get used to it. But I shouldn't try to fumble through my scriptures and fix everything to please them. Because, for number one, they'll never be pleased. They're not pleased with theistic evolutionists. They're not pleased with them either. So, but I read you these two quotes. I think I'm so thankful Strauble put them right next to each other. Because I think he's seeking to demonstrate the same thing. What sounds so, well, this is the way it is, in just a short amount of time can be completely questioned. Then his first chapter is by a guy by the name of Jonathan Wells, and he gives Wells's credentials, and just listen to him. Wells wrote a book called The Icons of Evolution, where he takes all of the drawings that I saw in high school, in my science and biology classes, that quote unquote demonstrate the validity of evolution that these scientists drew up. And so Wells wrote this book, The Icons of Evolution. It's a good title, isn't it? Icon, sort of like idol sort of idea. That these drawings are a bunch of hocus pocus. That when you actually start looking at the details and the data, it's deplorable what they do. And scientists know that these are a joke and that they're still in the textbooks and they're still going on. So listen to this guy's background. In 1994, Wells received a doctorate in molecular and cell biology from Berkeley, where he focused primarily on vertebrae, embryology, and evolution. He later worked at Berkeley as a postdoctorate research biologist. Wells has written on the scientific and cultural aspects of evolution in such journals as Origins and Design, The Scientist, Touchstone, The American Biology Teacher, and Rhetoric and Public Affairs, while his technical articles with such scintillating titles as Microtubule Mediated Transport of Organelles and Localization of Beta-catenin to the future dorsal side of the Xenopus eggs. Go look that up. And they've appeared in such other magazines. So basically what Strauble is trying to do is saying, this guy's an educated guy, all right, if this didn't demonstrate that. And then he goes on to write this book that just says, look at these things. And he goes one by one, and he takes all these different pictures. You remember, if those of you who went to secular high school where you saw the baby with the quote-unquote gills that is supposed to replicate other species that we develop in the same way, retracing our evolutionary origins. And he says, it's just hocus pocus. And he goes through it. I can't take the time to do it, but it's just phenomenal. He basically says, look, he says, I don't want to make it that simple, but when you bend your neck gets ripples in it. And he's like, that's about as bad as it is. And you just got to read it. You really would enjoy this book. Okay, the next person he interviews is Stephen Meyer, who has degrees in physics, geology, got his master's in history and philosophy of science from Oxford. And so he's a very educated guy, to say the least. And he says in his interview with him, and this is Stephen Myers responding, and he does a lot of debates. You can look him up online. Not all these guys are young earth creationists. Stephen Myers, I don't believe is. He's an intelligent design guy, which they really avoid talking about young earth, old earth. They stick to there is an intelligent design. They start there. And he says, if it's true there's a beginning to the universe, as modern cosmologists now agree, then this implies a cause that transcends the universe. If the laws of physics are fine-tuned to permit life, as contemporary physicists are discovering, then perhaps there's a designer who fine-tuned them. If there's information in the cell, as molecular biology shows, then this suggests an intelligent design. To get life going in the first place would have required biological information. The implications point beyond the material realm to a prior intelligent cause. Stephen Meyer points out that Richard Dawkins, and I quote, said, the machine code of the genes is uncannily computer-like. That's Richard Dawkins. The gene code is uncannily computer-like. And again, what does computer code tell you? That somebody wrote the code. And, one illustration was used, and they're not trying to be crass, but they're saying, look, if you went to a junkyard and you saw a Corvette, a 76 Corvette, and then a 78 Corvette, and then a 79 Corvette, and you saw that, you wouldn't assume that these Corvettes just developed themselves. You wouldn't assume that. You would assume that somebody built them. And I mean, you get to see what Paul's saying, where he said, professing to be wise, they became fools. And they're not trying to like oversimplify it, but they're just saying that's essentially what's going on here. It's just, in the end, it ends up being foolish. I want to close by playing for you, and Matthew, you'll have to stop the recording there.